Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John Carson. I am the managing partner at Trajectory Energy Partners. We're a solar development company based here in Illinois, and but really excited today to be moderating this panel with two fantastic people talking about what's going on right now in the climate sphere and how data is really impacting that field. Let's jump right in. I really want you guys to meet our two fantastic panelists who I've known and known for over 10 years. Have been part of these environmental fights before I was a solar developer, and really excited for this discussion. So, Ari Trujillo from the Sierra Club, tell everyone a little bit about your background and what you're doing now at the Sierra Club.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ari Trujillo, she, they pronouns from Ohlone Territory, aka East Oakland, California. I've worn a couple of hats in my career, but currently I'm the Deputy Director of Grassroots Power Building at the Sierra Club. And my background is I'm a data scientist and data director and field person that's also been everything from a full stack developer to an actual consultant and facilitator in the space. And yeah, most of my time I spend helping to facilitate our 1.6 million active base members and our over 6 million folks that we actually organize every month to drive them towards climate action. So I'll turn it over to Pete.
Excellent. Pete from LCV, tell everyone your background and what you're doing now at LCV.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Ari. I'm Pete Maysmith. I'm the Senior Vice President of Campaigns at LCV. I split time between Denver and Washington, D.C. I've been part of the LCV family of organizations for about a dozen years or so. I ran Conservation Colorado, which is LCV's affiliate, of course, in Colorado, for a long time, and have been in my current role for about 3.5 years or so. In this role, I oversee and help to drive forward all of our independent expenditure electoral work, and then a lot of our organizing, non-electoral organizing work. So, for example, right now we care a lot about the American Jobs Plan and passing big, bold, progressive climate. And so my team, working certainly cross-departmentally with a bunch of great colleagues at LCV, and then working throughout what we call our conservation voter movement. Those are all the state LCVs, like Conservation Colorado, around the country. So we're working together to pass bold, progressive climate and climate justice legislation.
Excellent. Well, the first context-setting question I have for both of you is, where do you think we are in this climate moment right now, particularly coming off the last 12 years, maybe the high hopes that everyone had at the beginning of the first Obama term, some of the discontent that happened later. I was actually physically in the White House when it was surrounded completely on all sides by people protesting the Keystone Pipeline. Then we had the Trump years, and now we have this moment of hope, but also, well, so much intense activity is happening on other fronts. And to keep you guys on your toes, I'm going to mix up the order here. Pete, you go first on that one.
Thanks, John. This is an enormously exciting opportunity for climate. You just gave a really great, lightning summary of where we've been, say, the last 12 years. But I would call out the fact that the Waxman-Markey bill, the cap and trade, it's got all sorts of different names, back in 2009, 2010. I'm not going to go into the policy around it or anything like that, but it was a big piece of climate legislation. It's not what we're working on now from a policy perspective. What we're doing now is far superior, but the point is there was an effort to move big climate policy through the Congress, and it didn't work. It didn't work. It moved through the House, never got a vote in the Senate, and never went anywhere past that. And I think we are in a markedly different, a markedly better place today because the movement is far more diverse. It's broader. It's stronger. And we've also seen from the American public far more support and really, frankly, demand, especially from the Biden coalition voters, for action on climate change, clean energy, jobs, and environmental justice. So it's still a tough hill to climb, John. I mean, you know, I just saw an ad today, you know, with what the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, are doing. The pushback will be fierce and intensive from the fossil fuel industries and the fossil fuel connected folks. But that doesn't matter. We have to, you know, overcome that.
Ari, same question to you. How would you describe this moment we're in right now?
Yeah, I come from a slightly different background than Pete. Like, this is my first pure environmental job. I've mostly come from electoral politics and organized labor and the queer civil rights movement. And so when I look at where we're at in terms of the environmental movement, it's also really, at least for the Sierra Club, really shifting into intersectional multi-issue organizing, right? Like, we've kind of all historically been in our separate camps in some ways. At least I know that that's how like different folks have thought about it, right? We have like our conservation folks are over here, right? And then our folks that are trying to dismantle the fossil fuel industry over there. And really, I think, and the folks who are caring about things like democracy, right, are like kind of sitting on the edge. And right now, at least the way we're talking to our folks about it and also trying to orient them towards is more towards that really multifaceted sort of viewpoint of things, not only in the name of helping to push really hard on the American Jobs Plan, but also really building up for the big backlash that we know we're about to experience in this next wave of elections. And really, when we look at, and I think it's important not to separate the 348 voter suppression bills that we're seeing, right, all across the states, right, from the moment and momentum that we're actually gaining as we're trying to push around the American Jobs Plan and what is about to become like this giant infrastructure package we're all going to force through reconciliation. And so when I look at the terrain, right, like, I'm like, our Fed policy folks are amazing and they're like in the Hill and really like focusing hyper intensely on this package. And I'm also really there for them in terms of mobilizing all of our people. And the thing that I am haunted by is, what is our state-based strategy for actually carrying home the next stage of this? And what does it actually look like for when we're actually, based upon like, if we get a clean energy standard somewhere in here, which feels like likely and hopeful, right? Like, how good is it and what is the terrain in which we're fighting, particularly against natural gas? And that fight most likely will actually be a thing that we have to take at the state level, and really like leaning on folks, right, like Massachusetts and California to truly lead in ways that sometimes they sound like they're going to do, but then when we actually get to the spirit of implementation, right, kind of falters. And so Illinois has a bunch of amazing work they've been doing on that for a really long time. And I think for me, really, I'm thinking beyond like this cycle that we have, which is an amazing opportunity that is like the outcome of a bunch of really amazing, like, bolstering of climate to being like a core issue of the party. And what does it look like for it actually to become a core aspect of all of our state-based organizing going forward for the next 10 years? Because I think that shift, I think we're about to get there, and it hasn't been as intensive as it has been in terms of national discourse.
That's fantastic. I really like how you both highlighted that while the climate movement has matured and expanded its power, part of that has been by becoming more interconnected to other important issues. Ari, I'd like to, talking about your really interesting background from electoral politics. I know your first stint as an organizer was actually on the Obama campaign back in 2007 during the primaries. Seeing all the different types of organizing and how it's involved and where we're at now, talk about actually how technology has changed, how it's, has it made true grassroots organizing more possible? What are you seeing on that front?
I'm one of those folks that got to like grow up, right, with like the very first new media departments is what they were called at the time, and it makes me feel so old, right? And I get to like marvel at like the generation that's coming up behind me, right, who are very much like the TikTok organizer generation. I think it has made distributed grassroots power like much more visible than it used to be, right? And I do think this is a personal stance, so pardon the propaganda here. I don't think there's anything new that happens in organizing. I think it just happens in different mediums and different channels, right? So I was having a conversation with someone about what should distributed organizing look at, like at the Sierra Club, and it's like we have 64 chapters, right? Like that was the original distributed organizing network, with someone would write a letter in Oakland and it would go out to a bunch of folks all over the country, right? And then they would all be like, okay, this is what we're doing for the next 6 months. And so that, I think that technology has made it easier for more people to get into organizing. I think the other side of it is that we have not adjusted our staffing models and our technology models to actually support the core of distributed and the stack that we have. And once upon a time, I was Deputy National Data Director for the Bernie campaign in 2016. And so we wired together a lot of the stack that everyone's used to now, which is like P2P and Slack, and like using like a giant dialer to call everyone and doing all that sort of like grind people through this big mechanic. And I don't think we ever really adjusted for this, the way the ratios changed for organizers. From, it used to be, back in my day, it used to be 1 to every 500 volunteers, right, was what you were looking at as an organizer. And now you're looking at 1 to 10,000 volunteers. And so how are we like actually like supporting folks as they're coming through? And how are we actually doing kind of that deeper engagement where we're training folks to be organizers, right? Alongside like meeting them where they're at in terms of their enthusiasm, because I think that's one of the growth edges that we're at, right? So we've gotten scale, which is amazing. But I do think one of the challenges we now have as a movement is how do we get scale and speed also turned into depth and longevity? Because I think this is also something that has been like a thing I've been terrified of for a while, is not losing, right, a lot of the folks that got really excited and got really involved in the wake of the Trump years. And now we have to teach these folks, like, this is what it looks like when we have governing power. And it requires a tactical shift, right, from mobilization to doing different styles of coalition work. And so I do think we have a growth edge there. I don't think it's changed organizing. I think it's given us different problems and challenges in organizing, if that makes any sense.
Boy, I really love your key point there that, you know, essentially humans in organizing haven't changed, but technology has gotten more people in and given us more tools. Pete, you and I could probably play the game where we see who's got the oldest organizer story. I once had to fax in my report on a campaign I worked on. Let's see if you can beat that, and then tell us how you've seen this technology evolution impact the organizing that's happening.
It's enormously exciting. If the TikTok generation, Ari, makes you feel old, I think that makes me a fossil, I'm sorry to say. I'm definitely the old one in the bunch, but oh well, I hope people won't tune me out because of that. Every Saturday morning, John faxed in reports from the weekly canvas, in by 11 a.m. or whatever the timeline was, and definitely grew up with the paper clipboards, and that's what we did, right? You're door to door, you're in the streets, and everything's a clipboard. You're writing everything down, the signatures and transferring it, and yada, all this sort of stuff no one wants to hear about. But that was a long time ago, right? Ari is so right. Of course she is. Organizing is organizing, right? We know how to engage people. Sometimes it is face-to-face with a clipboard in one's hands. Sometimes it's, on an app. Sometimes it's via a phone call. There's all this different, and so our world has just expanded so much, and it's enormously exciting to see that. I think the other thing, though, that is really exciting about it is the data that comes with it, and understanding what motivates people, and our ability to do analytics connected to organizing is so much more sophisticated, at least certainly from my perspective, than when I was cutting, my teeth as a young organizer, with those, fax machines and paper pieces, paper clipboards, on clipboard. We didn't really know what worked. We look at numbers and say, oh, well, we talked to this many people today and this many said yes. So therefore, probably the script we're using is good, and probably where we're talking to people is smart. It was a little bit more sophisticated than that, but not a lot. The analysis that we can do now about how to engage people, Ari, you're so right. Like, oh my God, we engaged so many people over the last 4 or 5 years. And what are we going to do to keep them engaged over the course of these next, well, hopefully forever, but let's just start with over the course of the next 3 to 4 years right now, this presidential term, 3.5 plus years, understanding how to do that, what's effective, what we think might be effective, sorry for background noise, and what isn't effective. Our knowledge base of that has gone up, and I think that's enormously exciting.
Wow. Following through on this thread for a second, could you each give an example of a specific interesting insight that came from some of the analysis of your volunteers or your messaging? Ari, do you have some good examples on that front?
Yeah, I got originally pulled into the Sierra Club as a consultant, and we were having what turned out to be a very philosophical conversation about, like, what is our power and how do we measure our power, right? And, like, what does that mean? And I think one of the things that was really interesting from doing like a mass historic data analysis of all of our action takers, right? But also all of our, and by action takers, I mean, we set like a pretty high bar for it, right? Like it needed to be meaningful action. It wasn't like petition signers and stuff like that. But like, did you call a member of Congress, right? Like, did you go to a training, that sort of thing? And I think there were two kind of things that were really interesting. One is that our base of folks who take action is larger than our base of our membership, right? Which a lot of folks had conflated and thought that like our members were the majority of our action takers or all of our action takers, and they are, but there's this really amazing, about a time and a half larger than our membership base of folks who like are organized by us, right? Who are not yet dues paying members of the Sierra Club. So that was like really interesting. And another side of it was like, you know, the organization's like a redwood tree, right? Like it's 125 years old. And so like, it was like, well, who are we and who should we be? And what should our relationship be to like Sunrise and LCB and Greenpeace and Audubon and all of these things? And when we did our analysis, we looked at our people, right? It's like, our folks are like Democratic primary voters. And so it's like, let's not have a debate anymore about like, who are we? I think the current president of Planned Parenthood said it really well, is like, they're not a reproductive justice organization, and that's okay, right? So like, it's just like, how do they be a just version of what they are? And I think like for us, our analysis, right, of our actual current base of people and who are we organizing and how do they vote and how do they show up in other parts of the movement, allowed us to have like is starting a conversation that we're having right now, which is like, it's okay that we're not an environmental justice organization. Like that's okay. Like there's cool stuff we can do that's different, right? So how do we be a just version of who we are? And how are we wielding the power? We're not lying to ourselves about the power and influence that we have in space. And how are we wielding it in a just way and just partnership with folks that are on the ground who don't have the access to the speaker's office that we do, for example, but are doing really amazing transformational work in like Africatown, Alabama, as an example. And so I think it's like, there's a lot of tactical examples right around individual strategies or individual scripts or framing or narrative, right, that are also really interesting. But I've been really like, because I'm interested in this like 100-year organizing conversation about like, what are we trying to build? I think us being able to have a deeper like conversation about who we are in space was actually probably my favorite of them that we've actually been able to have over the last couple of years.
Wow, that is fascinating, because I'm a Sierra Club member. I'm a huge fan of the Sierra Club, but to see data play such a role in helping such an old organization understand who they are is fascinating. Pete, what's your favorite examples of what data has really allowed you to see that maybe couldn't see before?
Sure. I think from a volunteer engagement perspective, we've got climate action teams, staffs of organizers in a number of our states that work with, volunteers, activists, recruit them, bring them in, and then obviously engage them to take action around climate and environmental justice issues. We did an analysis of those volunteers and then looked at demographic information, income, race, and age, to name three of them, and then found out what to different, based on income, what do folks like to do or tend to do more or less? Based on race, what do they tend to do more or less? And then same question around age. So for example, with income, as people make more money, they're less inclined to, do one-on-ones and write letters and canvassing. They're more inclined to make calls to decision makers, for example. We also learned that from age, that younger volunteers are more likely to do canvassing and one-on-one meetings, to write letters, to come to events. They aren't very likely to call decision makers. Older folks tended to want to call decision makers. There's a lot more data that lives under that. Those are just a couple of examples. So again, for us, information's power, right? We all know that. One, we want to then both target our asks to make sure that we're having conversations with our volunteers that they're more likely to do and engage and resonate with them. And in addition to that, also, if it's something that a demographic is less inclined to do, understand why that is, and can we change that, right? So if a young person is less inclined to make a call to a decision maker, what do we need to do to engage that young person so that they will ultimately choose to make a call to a decision maker and not just attend an event, which we totally want them to do as well, right? So how can we make our organizing more well-rounded, more holistic, and speak to different segments of the world that that we're organizing and talking to? So that's just some recent analysis that I found really interesting. That again, our climate action organizing teams are actually, it's usable, it's actionable, right? They're putting lessons from that into practice almost as we speak, John.
Wow, those are insights we did not used to get from our fax machines.
Exactly. That's that point. We're like, I don't know. Seem like people like to do something. Let's keep asking them. We're well past that now.
Yep. So the reason for my interesting background here is I'm in the village of Ford Heights, which is in far southern Cook County in Illinois, where we are working on a low-income community solar program. I've got a meeting at Village Hall as soon as this is over, so I'm at a park here. And this is definitely what you would absolutely classify as an environmental justice community. It's actually the lowest income community in Illinois, and has just a history of abandoned fields that I'm looking at here, full of pollution. And I am really proud to see the environmental movement take on environmental justice as so much more of a core tenet. So I'm curious both your thoughts on that subject, how you're seeing data either engage or maybe not be able to engage environmental justice communities in this advocacy. Ari, do you want to go first?
So it's so interesting, and I'm really glad you're out there, John. I actually come from what is historically considered an EJ community. I come from the east side of San Jose. I live in East Oakland now, and I think it's really interesting. I think so. Two things. So one is like there's the whole question of how are we adjust Big Green, right? Like honoring who and what we are. And one of those ways is that we can offer folks access to resources and data and technology infrastructure, so we can as an example, right, like actually help support the analysis and building of a rigorous, statistically significant, community health survey, right, in Southern Alabama, as an example, right, in a way that the EJ partners on the ground, they just don't have the staffing and support and cash to do. And so we can work in coalition with them, right, because people will talk to them who will not talk to us, to work in coalition with them so that they can have the impact and have the conversations they want to, and then also be able to learn from them and publish the results of them, right, in a way that we can kind of lend our infrastructure and muster for. So I think that's one thing. But I think the place where it is important not to, because I think we do rush to data and technology as a panacea for all of our ills, is to conflate earning the right to organize, right, with having analysis, right, that this is the future of our terrain. So as an example, right, as we're having this conversation about who are we as the Sierra Club, when we look at the map of top 10 energy producing states and we look at where our folks hit first and worst by the climate crisis, and you look at a map of Sierra Club members, our folks are not, our membership is not there, right? And so we do have folks there. I want to be clear, right? It's not that there is no overlap, right, between Sierra Club membership and folks who live in EJ communities such as myself. We are there. And I think it's really important to think about kind of the classic framework from the Freedom Summer of earning the right to organize people, right? And what does it actually look like for us to show up in communities in just partnership, not stepping on other people's work? And also, how do we educate our base so folks are functioning from a solidarity and not from a charity framework? Because it's also one of the things that also cooled me on environmental movements for a really long time, was having what I experienced as a poor kid on the east side, right, as white folks who liked hikes, right, telling me about what we were supposed to do, right? And it's where are you around cops, right? Where are you around healthcare access, right? All these things that for me are interconnected, but folks only wanted to talk about one thing. And so I think that solidarity framework, that intersectional analysis framework, is work we have to do with our bases, right, as a part of entering into communities. And I think also being really mindful of our positional power, right, when we're walking into space, and what does it look like to, as E40 likes to say, right, to come correct to people, and actually not step on other folks' work, right, as it is very clear our terrain of work is walking into those areas that they haven't been in as much before, and we're walking into new terrain. So that's the thing I've been thinking about a lot. I don't know if that answers the question.
Absolutely. Pete?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of thoughts. First off, what Ari laid out just makes a ton of sense, and is, you know, certainly some of what we're thinking about at LCV. To be specific, a couple of things come to my mind. One is thinking about data, right? We do a lot of testing on messaging, and what are the most powerful messages. And it is the case that it is not right now in this moment always the absolute most powerful message to be talking about environmental justice, to be talking about 40% of funding from AJP, the American Jobs Plan, in frontline and fence line communities that, as Ari said, are hit first and worst from the climate crisis and other pollution impacts, dirty air, dirty water, as we all know. That doesn't mean that we should not use that messaging. Now, do we use that messaging all the time? No, we don't, and I don't think we should. But you know, I think it is not something that we can then just kind of say, well, that's not our top testing message, so we will never talk about it. That would be a because if that's our answer, then it will never be the top testing message, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that, I think, is one. Two is, you know, John and Ari, I mean, I just mentioned real briefly the 2009 congressional battle over climate. And, you know, one of the things is that environmental justice was nowhere in the mix from part of the conversation. And now the environmental justice community properly is much more centered and is centered in the conversation. And what that means, and let's be specific, when push comes to shove and there are hard choices and a bill is starting to move, it is simply not in the realm of even just acceptable, but just it's not part of the conversation that, oh, maybe we'll drop the Justice 40. Maybe we'll drop EJ from it to move something else through the bill. That can't happen. That's not what our community looks like and is anymore, which is an entirely good thing. I hope I'm being crystal clear on that, an entirely good thing. But it's not like, oh, well, maybe we'll in essence trade off, you know, from a policy perspective, which all that means is, we're trading off communities. We're trading off communities like where Ari grew up and saying tough luck. Like, that's no longer an option in this conversation. And that is obviously the way it should be, not an option. So
before we go to Q&A, and I imagine the audience has some questions for you two fantastic panelists. What are, you know, some other points you really want to emphasize that people be thinking about? Where you think, you know, we've told a lot of stories about the past. Where you think things are going? Ari, why don't you go first?
Thank you so much for that. I'm kind of reflecting on the thing that Pete was just talking about, and I really appreciate you naming Pete. Like, if we only talk about it when it's performing well, it's never going to perform well, right? Like, I think about a part of how we're in the fake and disinformation shaft in a huge way, right, is because lies perform really well algorithmically, right, and nuance doesn't in the same way. And so I do think that it's also one of the cautionary things about data is people be like, well, this doesn't test well, so it's not the thing that we should be doing. And I think there's a strategic cowardice that comes from that, right? And it's also a weaponization that folks use, right? And famously, I've gotten into several fights with people about conflating, right, like what polls well with certain demographics of people with what should the message of the party be, or what should the stance or strategy be for the organization. And so I do think one of the things that was a little bit in my answer, but is a thing that I've been reflecting on a lot, is also base transformation, right? There are a lot of people in the climate movement who do not care about intersectional analysis and do not care about like structural racism or oppression. And it's one of the things that makes it sometimes challenging for folks to enter into the climate justice movement or find an organizing home inside of it, particularly Black and brown folks, right? Is like there is a need for us to do a lot of that tilling of soil and a lot of that architectural work that we actually have done in a huge way inside of the Democratic Party over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We are also, it feels like the climate movement is like 10 years behind the party in terms of what we're actually trying to do there in terms of tilling soil. And so it does mean that there's some folks who are going to be like, this is not the place for me anymore. Right. And that's okay. Right. Having like an actual analysis around like the genocidal impacts, right, of the Murian ideology of conservation, having a real conversation about that doesn't mean we don't approve of conservation anymore. It just means we need to be mindful of our impacts as we're pushing policy. And so I do think that that reckoning, right, is something that's real, that organizations across the movement have had to have over the last 20 years, but is, I think, coming in a really big way for us in the climate space, right, is like, who should our base be? right? What does it mean to transform it, right? So that it actually works for the next generation of folks that we're trying to organize with and for. And what does it actually look like for us to be honest about sometimes of the pain of that decision point, right? When we have a base of folks who really respond well to wolves, like how do we start talking to them, right, about energy burden in the Deep South?
Excellent. Pete, other thoughts that you really think were important, or thoughts on where you think we are going or need to go?
Well, yeah, sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for all of that, Ari. I mean, I do just want to I want to add something that goes in a little bit of a different direction, but I just want to agree that we need to be clear-eyed about what this movement looks like now, and more importantly, where it's going in the future. And if that means folks that have been a part of it for a while, this doesn't feel like their home anymore because we're talking about more than wolves, for example, then that's okay. And we need to, we LCD, obviously I don't speak for Sierra Club, but, we need to, as a movement, be okay with that. So I just think that's really important. John, the other thing I would just add, and I'm thinking from a data perspective, and you said, well, we've talked a lot about the past, also kind of the present right now. And I think a lot about messaging and a major program that we ran, this is with our electoral hat on through the LCD Victory Fund, last year was an environmental swing voters program. So it's targeting 1.6 million voters in the presidential race in 6 battleground states. And it was a 12-week program, digital and mails, getting ready to launch. And then COVID hit. And we're like, uh-oh, time out. What is this going to, obviously we hit the pause button because who the hell's lived through a pandemic before and knows how that influences a political program? Not me. And what we did then is work to understand how coronavirus, how COVID fit into the conversation we wanted to have with these swing voters that cared about the environment. And that was going to be centered on clean air, clean water, and climate change. And so we used what I thought was some really interesting testing to go out with with 5 messages connected to coronavirus, and how could we link that together, and what did work, again, for that target audience, not for Susie Q public, right? Not for our base. These are swing voters, right? And what didn't work. And we saw some backlash in some of the messages, but we found one, denialism. And when we linked Donald Trump's denialism of COVID to denialism of climate change, and did good creative around that was highly effective. We only knew that through creative testing, through data, and through analysis and analytics. So that's something that we really, I think, benefited from, and is an example of kind of where the movement's heading when we run. I mean, for us, that was a big program, $14 million. Like, that's a big political program. And we had to get it right. And it was because of data and analysis that allowed us to get it right.
Excellent. I believe we have some questions. Patrice?
Yes, we do. Thank you, John. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Ari. I mean, it's been such an incredible conversation that it is sparking some questions here. And sticking with the kind of topic of message testing, one question that has come in: when you say you lean on message testing to dial in your research, are you operating on a tactical level, such as campaign by campaign, or a strategic level, such as an overall approach?
You or me, Ari? I think that's me. Okay, I'll start. Both is the answer. So at a strategic level, to understand how to frame the issues that we want to be working on, how to have a conversation, sometimes it's with our base to engage and activate them from an organizing perspective, or from a voter engagement, turnout perspective. Sometimes the example I just gave more from a swing audience, but kind of that strategic, how do we want to frame these issues that position both the movement but then the issue, thinking about ultimately we exist to solve the climate crisis and to bring more environmental justice. And of course I have background noise again, sorry. There you go. The Zoom era. And so that's from a strategic perspective. Wow, that's loud. And then from a tactical perspective, using the Civis creative testing tool when we literally are developing for that environmental swing voter program that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago. We ended up running, I think, something like 37 digital ads. We produced 50, 55. So what's that, 15-ish that no one ever saw except like 20 of us, right? No one ever saw it because we would put it through the Civis tool and they generated backlash or they were just flat. They did not move people, right? And so that's at the tactical level. Might have been some creative that we were really excited about that just didn't work out when it was put out in the real world. And so we just, dropped it on the floor and walked away from it. So maybe that's a little bit of the answer to strategic versus tactical, both, and some examples of when we do that.
Thank you, Pete. Ari, do you have anything to add there?
I think for us, right, our strategies are really set around what are the most dramatic interventions we can push for strategically, and then mapping those interventions against what are our unique strengths as an institution. And what is for us as an example, right, we're having this really fun conversation about what is the organizing model and structure we need to have in order to achieve our 2050 goals, as an example. And it really is kind of the same sort of moment that folks had around in the 70s around passing the Clean Water and Air Acts, right, that required dramatically increasing the size of the Sierra Club and shifting what it had been from a historically white hiking organization, right, to being this massive juggernaut of legislative and lobbying power. And so how do you really shift? For us, really, we're looking around, our data is informing our strategy in terms of stance, but also it's then informing an organizing and strategy conversation at a really high level around what should our infrastructure be, right, in order for us to be furthering these 20, 30, 50-year goals that we have. And I think on the other side, when it's looking at tactics, I want to give a shout out to a cohort called the West Kootenai Eco Society. They're doing amazing stuff around doing deep canvassing in industry towns in British Columbia, right, around how do you actually take climate, which still feels very abstract to a lot of people as a topic, in a way that abortion access and trans rights are very visceral, right? Climate feels really abstract to folks. How are you taking that and providing connective tissue to connect to folks who identify with steel and coal mills, right? How do you actually get them to identify the asthma rates that are happening inside of their neighborhood, right? With actually the issues of the climate crisis that are raining down on their heads. And so I do think there's a lot of really amazing data work that's happening there around how are we organizing and talking to people, but our strategic stance of so what are the tactical interventions are also being informed by the scale of impact we're trying to have. So a slightly different answer than Pete's, but basically kind of the same approach.
And I have to say, that's why you both are so fantastic to have on this panel, because of your different views and takes of each question. So this is great. Do want to turn a little bit, have a fantastic question here. And this, I think, is getting back to something that was mentioned earlier about kind of where we stand from a political view and how that can impact climate. So the question here is, how are you all thinking about the role of the environmental community in protecting our democracy? The GOP voter suppression campaign could keep it in enough power to block policy. So how do we adapt to that? It's a pretty big question. Who wants to go first on that one?
I'm bubbling. I need to summon a lovely, amazing organizer named Courtney Height, who works at the Sierra Club and has been sitting at democracy tables and working a coalition with the ACLU and the NAACP and a whole bunch of really amazing folks for over 10 years. And for a while, she was it literally just started as her being the democracy program, right? And now she obviously has an amazing team of folks. And so for us, we don't separate them because we can't separate them, right? We can't be an organization that believes in kind of living at that Wellstone triangle of elected officials and policy and grassroots power. We can't separate democracy, right, from that. That sets the terrain of the fight we're having. And so I think this year, more than any year, democracy has been a huge thing at the Sierra Club. So how do we come out swinging hard for HR1, right, and for the People Act? How are we going to go down really fighting really hard for the VRA? How is that related to a conversation with the filibuster? We just took the stance of pushing to abolish the filibuster at the Sierra Club, which is huge, right, so that we can stand in coalition to push really hard from the leftmost flank, which is tactically a shift for us as an organization. And so you can't separate democracy from climate. I don't think it's actually not possible. And I think when you look at any of the strategic terrain that's available to us, even if we are dramatically able to reform our democracy, right, we're still living in a post-Citizens United world. And so tactically what's possible at a federal level is just going to be significantly different and culturally significantly different, regardless of the makeup of the chamber. And so I am thinking a lot about things like that. And when we're looking at this 20, 30-year strategy. But democracy is the bedrock foundation of everything we're looking at doing strategically, which is also why when we were talking about state-based strategy earlier, right, like democracy and voting rights laws in states are really a proving ground, right, for what we're going to be able to push in terms of dramatic climate results. Because of the folks that are hit first and worst by the climate crisis are locked out of being able to vote about whether or not their children are poisoned on a daily basis, we have no hope of winning.
If I could chime in, Patrice, totally and completely agree. Democracy is foundational to solving the climate crisis, right? When democracy reigns, we win. When anti-democratic forces are able to exert their will at the state level, recently in Georgia, trying in Texas, Arizona, etc., then that's when we stand a much, much tougher road to win, because that's the fossil fuel industry. It's the wealthiest industry on the planet, and it has made sure that Black and brown folks suffer at the heel of their plants and their facilities for a long time, and has locked out what is a majoritarian position to move forward on clean energy, on climate, on jobs, and on justice. That's where we win that conversation with the American public. We lose it when it's connected to money and the fossil fuel interest. And so for us at LCV, we're doing a new strategic plan right now, literally as we have this conversation. We do it after every election or every presidential cycle, as you might expect from us, since we do so much in the political space, right? Democracy is co-equal with climate change. Democracy is in the plan more than the words climate change is are in the plan, right? That's new for us. We've always cared about it, but we're elevating it. Maybe we should have elevated it sooner. You can say we're late to the game. Okay, fine, guilty as charged. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to focus on where we're going, which is just elevating it because it's bedrock. That's with the conservation voter movement, our 32 state LCVs around the country, as I said, and then certainly at the federal level, Ari said it, HR 1 for the people, the John Lewis Act, all the key provisions that need to become law. So, yes, big one.
Okay, with that, we are at time. And I must say, I feel like that was the rally cry that we needed to end on. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Pete. I think what you've done is really energize this discussion and will give us a lot of thinking for ways that all nonprofits can engage and really show their power, because this is such a critical point that we need to make as an org, as a society. So with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and your expertise. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.